Welcome, welcome. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Thank you all for joining us for Behavior Analyst Talks About Abortion with Dr. Charles Catania. Thank you so much, Charlie, for doing this. And I wanted to thank each and every single one of you for attending. Now, over the next about a little less than 2 hours, you're going to have the chance to earn a couple of CEUs. And the way that you're going to earn those CEUs is by staying the entire time and by answering some poll questions that are going to be popping up on your screen. So you were emailed a couple of reminder emails, and during one of them, probably just about half an hour ago to an hour ago, had a big orange button that said join webinar. So I hope you joined with that join webinar button, and if you didn't, please go ahead and do so. If you dialed in audio only on your phone and you're not joined on or with that button, GoToWebinar cannot log your attendance. So we will have no way of tracking that you're here. So we will not be able to give you any kind of certificate, whether that is a CE certificate or a general certificate of attendance. Now, if you do need that general certificate of attendance and you don't need CEUs today, then you will be emailed that certificate just about an hour after we end here today, and that's completely free of charge. Now, just keep in mind that that is a general certificate of attendance. It's not your CE certificate. Your CE certificate will come on Monday. All right, I'll go into detail about CEUs when the first poll question comes up. Go ahead and put your questions in the questions box. I'll answer the ones that I can. Otherwise, we will have time for Q&A throughout the webinar. And if you didn't get a copy of the handouts emailed to you a few hours ago or earlier this morning, then you can download them from the handouts section of the control panel. If you have any trouble, go ahead and send us an email to support@bds.com. All right, let me turn myself off and turn it over to Dr. Catania.
Well, greetings, everybody. So as you can see, the title is A Behavior Analyst Talks About Abortion. And here it does seem appropriate to put in a trigger warning. Some attendees may find some of the content disturbing or offensive. But this is obviously this is a controversial topic. I'll come back to that in a little bit and tell you a little bit about how we came to decide on doing a session on a topic like this. Most of what I'll be talking about is drawn at least from the orientation that's provided in my book called The ABCs of Behavior Analysis, which does include a bit of the material that we've been doing in recent webinars, even though they're pretty far-ranging topics. Anybody who's interested in it, if you use the link shown at the bottom, you get a discount from the publisher. Anyway, but moving on, just as a general outline of what we're going to be doing, the availability of abortion, it's obviously still a contentious issue in our politics, and it's compounded by all kinds of things, religious views, questions about the conflicting rights of the mother and the fetus, verbal labels. We'll be talking later about the difference between the language of pro-life and pro-choice and things of that sort. Concentrating on questions like when life begins or when personhood begins, it tends to lead us to dichotomize pregnancy and into some period of time before but not after which abortions are tolerated, and the people differ on where they want to put that line. But what we will do as behavior analysts, and one of the things that we're going to do is to look at pregnancies as continua during which the fetus is developing continuously and see if we can say anything about what implications that has. And if we were to do that, we especially would want to consider changes in behavior as when a fetus becomes responsive to the mother's voice or other stimuli that may enter the uterus, mostly auditory, of course. These things are the things we want to take into account when we consider what the legal criteria for abortion might look like if we base them on behavioral dimensions rather than other kinds of dimensions. So that's a kind of a summary. Some of these things we're just going to necessarily pass over fairly quickly. Others we'll talk about in a bit more detail. Already in this series, we've talked about other contentious topics: gun control, race, sex, and gender. And we've also talked about some basic concepts and their applications and their implications. So I thought I'd spend the first minute or so at least talking about how we got here. I was essentially talking with Steve Eversole of BDS about the series, and somewhere along the course of the conversation, we reviewed the fact that we'd gone through some of these controversial topics, and I was wondering what we might additionally add to the list when we decided to continue going with this for a little while. As some of you know now, this whole series is the earlier episodes are available via YouTube. Of course, you can't go back to them now and get CEU credits, but if you want to just look at them, they are available. And those of you who teach, if you wanted to excerpt some of that for your courses, I know that's happened in some instances. That's one of the reasons for doing this. One of the reasons I started doing it was that our field is more and more involved with public issues. It's more and more involved not only with our own specific issues as we deal with, say, a child on the autism spectrum, or as we deal with other kinds of applications, but we're more and more concerned where we stand in the culture, especially since there's so many things going on with respect to questions um, about behavior analysis. Some people still mix up our behavior analysis with what Ivar Lovaas called applied behavioral analysis back when he was doing his very earliest work with kids on the autism spectrum, and he was using aversive control. And some parents whose children are now long ago became adults, now describe themselves as PTSD ABA parents. Now that kind of thing is still a vocabulary that exists amongst some special ed teachers and so forth. If that's the way things are, then we've got to come up with our position with respect to dealing with these issues. And it's a very, very long and difficult thing to do, but we've got to gradually change these views and make them consistent with our more contemporary ways of doing things in behavior analysis now. So these things gave me an opportunity to think about these things, to put them together in an organization. Perhaps one of these days I'll be able to get around to doing a new edition of that book that I showed you the cover of a little bit ago. So Steve and I were talking about things like that, and I was talking about the topics that I would like to expand on eventually in a public version that could be used in the textbook where students could benefit from it. And he mentioned abortion, and at first I just didn't see the beginnings of tackling it, and then I began to think about it a little bit. So this talk today is based on my building on that suggestion that Steve made. Thought about it a little bit, thought, well, maybe I can do something. At least if I do, I will be exploring what our discipline might have to say. And I also have often worked on, I have this little, I don't know how well you can see that, this little paperweight that my wife gave me some time ago, and it reads, the ultimate inspiration is the deadline. And so by agreeing to do this talk, what I did was put myself in a situation where where I had to start looking into these things. And of course, it's a tricky kind of thing and a bit daunting because there's a vast literature out there with all the philosophical questions and the political questions, the legal questions, the ethical questions. But I thought I'd try to get there and try to have something to say. And I hope you will, by the time we get to the end of this, have some feeling for these issues and maybe come to the conclusion that maybe we behavior analysts do have something important to say. So that's a little bit of background. So this is my response to the challenge. So over my thinking about these kinds of things, I came up with several dimensions along which well, to talk about dimensions is kind of funny given what the first category is. Several kinds of topics which might be the organizing topics for discussing these issues. And one is that because we engage in verbal behavior, and verbal behavior is broken up into these units, at least at one level, called words. Of course, there are also units called books, and units called sentences, and units called phonemes. But the words are really important to the extent that they are related to dimensions out there in the world. As soon as you have words as discrete units, then whenever there's a continuum, we tend to then break it down into separate pieces with firm boundaries before maybe not so firm boundaries between them. And that seems to be a thing that runs across many of the issues we've discussed up till now in the earlier webinars. Then there's the whole business of signal detection, which is a thing that arose out of another area of psychology, just as behavior analysis arose out of the psychology of learning. Signal detection arose out of psychophysics, the study of sensory systems. And one of the affinities between people who studied psychophysics and people who study behavior analysis is they're both individual organism kinds of subject matters. You want to know about this particular person's problem with hearing or about this child's problems with vision. And you don't want to know about I mean, yes, you do want to know about the population in general, but the methodologies of single organism research are one thing that we share with signal detection. And signal detection became a way of looking at the things we do when we're dealing with stimuli out there in the world in a much more effective, much more quantitative way than the old days of just talking about, well, there's the reinforcement stimulus, or the SD, and there's the extinction stimulus, or the S delta. You have to not only worry about those two categories, but you have to worry about what happens if you respond or don't respond to the first, and you either respond or don't respond to the second, in which case you've got four classes now. The signal detection people call those hits and misses and false alarms and correct rejections. We'll get into just a little bit of that. We don't need to know all of that in fine detail. But it seemed that given that there are differential outcomes of different decisions, that kind of analysis might be relevant to talking about abortion too. And of course, we've got our long-standing history in behavior analysis of the distinction between using reinforcement and using positive techniques versus those of using aversive contingencies like Ivar Lovaas did in the early days of working with autism. So we can look at the aversive legal contingencies and pit them against the reinforcement contingencies that we might recommend. And that's a very general kind of issue. And certainly legal stuff is typically aversive. What can we contribute given that our field has an emphasis on the reinforcement alternatives? Then there's the role of verbal behavior I mentioned earlier on just a little bit. As soon as you talk about the distinction between pro-life and pro-choice, if you're talking about somebody who isn't pro-life, does that mean they're necessarily anti-life? Just by coining the terms, you set up things that predispose people to talk in certain ways. The language of rights is another thing, because where do rights exist in biology? If our field is built upon the biological sciences and then the behavioral sciences that are essentially a subset of the biological sciences, because behavior originates biologically, what can we say about this whole language of rights and where the ethical issues come from? And finally, then, to what extent, when people make their judgments about abortion, about a mother during pregnancy and so forth, to what extent do we know things about the behavior of the fetus and how that behavior changes over time? We'll spend just a little bit on that. It's a huge area of investigation, but it's also worth considering. And though I won't have a lot to say about it, I will certainly be able to point you to some places where you can find out a lot more if you're interested. Well, having said that much, you folks know that from time to time, we interrupt the presentations so that you can answer, or those people who are here for continuing education can answer one of the questions that they're required to answer in order to get continuing education credit. So we'll go to the first poll question, and I'll turn this over to Marissa for a moment, and then we'll come back to working on that list.
Alrighty, everybody. So The last slide showed in a blue box should have popped up on your screen, and you should be able to select an answer and lock it in with the submit button. Please do not put your answers in the questions box. If you have any trouble with the blue interface itself, you can put your answer in either the body of an email or a Word document, and you can email it to me after the webinar. Please make sure that you do participate in these poll questions. If you need your CEUs, you can still participate in them even if you just need your general certificate of attendance, but they are a requirement in order for you to be eligible to earn your CEUs. If you don't answer any, then you can't get your certificate. Just a little FYI there. Um, and I think that's all I have to say. If you didn't hear about certificates earlier, the general certificate of attendance, that's completely free of charge. It is not your CE certificate, so it will not have any BACB information. Will be distributed just about an hour after we end here today. And if you need your CE certificates, that's going to be coming to you, the instructions will be coming to you by lunchtime tomorrow. All right, let's shut this down. And it looks like 9% say abortion statistics, 77% say a working outline of this webinar, and 14% say a definition of amniocentesis.
Now, some of you may be wondering how 23%, that's almost a quarter of the people who are attending this webinar, couldn't say that the slide that came just before the one that's up there now, which is this one, couldn't say that what we spent at least a couple of minutes talking about was this slide. Let me, I'm editorializing a bit, but let me make this comment about this. BDS has been generous enough to say that all of these talks are going to be available as YouTubes for people who want to perhaps look at these topics and the way we talk about them again. And some people may then download parts of them and show them to students in their classes and so forth. You folks out there who are taking this for CU credits are a population of people who presumably will be delivering services to people, and you are representing us when this stuff gets shown to other audiences. If they see that 3/4 of the people who are watching this can answer a question like that, and the other quarter can't or doesn't, then that might get them to worry about what's going on with continuing education credits and so forth. And it might even lead people in continuing who worry about supervising this to toughen up criteria. So please stick with us. If you're here to get continuing education credits, spend enough time looking at it so that you can answer these questions correctly and represent us really well when people in other areas of the field who are not taking this for credit look at what we behavior analysts do. You are our representatives, not just getting credits for continuing education. But let's move on. That's my editorial comment. I will not comment on the ones in the future, but I ask you to look at the results. Now, the first category that I talked about in that outline was doing the dichotomization of continua. At that point and in that introduction, we discussed how verbal behavior made up of these discrete units called words forces us to break the continua down into discrete units. A familiar example is that the color spectrum is continuous. You know, it goes all the way, you watch the rainbow, and it just gradually changes from one color to another. But we end up learning sequences. Those of you who are old enough may remember that we used to have the mnemonic of Roy G. Biv to remember the names of the colors in the spectrum: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And there we're breaking down this continuum into these 7 different classes with different names. And of course, there are some people who can really get down and give specific names, and different cultures do break up these word boundaries in different places. But what else do we break down into discrete categories when they start as continua? In the past, in some previous presentations, we talked about race, and we talked about, so you have racial and caste differences. They vary continuously along many dimensions. Behavior could be one of them, but skin color, just a whole series of different things that lead people to give each other different names, and they become discrete categories. Ethnic differences, they're typically manifested in behavior, but and so you can see all sorts of practices in foods and in methods of education and in child rearing practices. And those too can change continuously. You can have different balances between reinforcement and aversive things, for example. But once you get them broken up into verbal labels, we humans get into real trouble with that. And they can lead to wars between populations. And some of those populations have historically, I mean, these are folks who are essentially close cousins. The biological characterization of Semites includes a whole range of people um, um, who you will find across the Middle East. Turns out I've discovered recently that I've got some of that ancestry in my genes. But these people will then form into dichotomized groups and end up having wars and fighting each other. And of course, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at this right now or whether you might be looking at it a year from now. There may be a different war going on that attracts our attention, and certainly you can all come up with the examples. There's way more than one, unfortunately. Now, let's take that then. Let's continue a little bit. Gender differences are typically dichotomized through the categories of female and male. But it turns out that individuals can vary continuously along the dimensions that define sex and gender. And in the earlier webinar on sex and gender, we talked about anatomy as a continuum, hormonal balance, behavior. And these get broken down into categories in which people identify certain combinations along these continuum. We have the LGBTQIA, and that's a growing list. And that just perpetuates these distinctions among groups when in fact there's a continuum, and we ought to be tolerant everywhere along those continua. So the relevance for today, the growth of a fetus over time is that this fetus is continuously growing. But if you want to control things with legal systems, then you've got to have some definitions. And so you end up with the control of abortion being based on the definition of points that separate life from non-life, that separate viability from non-viability, or you might come up with other dimensions. You might, if you're among a certain religious population, be talking about soul and when it enters the body. And certainly it's either there or not there, you would say. And so you've got this continuum and you impose this break in it. So once again, we've got this verbal problem. The words don't vary continuously, even though we arrange them along this continuum. The color spectrum, remember, is the example. So now we have this continuum that goes from conception all the way on through the mother's pregnancy until eventually the child is delivered. And the child is changing all throughout that, but a legal system might define a point at which you just get past that time, and suddenly there are things that were allowable before that are no longer allowable, in spite of what other contingencies might be involved. And that's without even getting into questions about what happens if you've got a child that has some kind of anatomical problem, so that the child is not even going to be viable. The child will end up being stillborn, or the pregnancy will result in a miscarriage. So all of those things become issues as we discuss this kind of a topic. Now, here's a quotation from a paper in 2004. Just as an illustration of this, it's a one kind of a statement that supports this point. Most opposition to abortion relies on the premise that the fetus is a human being, a person from the moment of conception. The premise is argued for, but not well. We are asked to notice that the development of a human being from conception through birth into childhood is continuous. To draw a line, to choose a point in this development and say before this point the thing is not a person, after this point it is a person, is to make an arbitrary choice for which no good reason can be given. It is concluded that the fetus is, or anyway we'd better say it is, a person from the moment of conception. I just might as well put a space in there right now. But this conclusion does not follow. Similar things might be said about the development of an acorn into an oak tree, and it does not follow that acorns are oak trees, or that we had better say they are. This is an argument by analogy. You start with looking at the early fetus, maybe at the time when it has become only just a few cells, and you compare that with the fetus just before birth. If the acorn is not an oak tree, the question is whether that early set of cells, and there are names for many of the early stages of the development of the fetus after conception, might follow about whether that is a person yet also. Arguments of this form are called slippery slope arguments, and opponents of abortion rely on them uncritically. Now notice, we're talking about people who argue against abortion. This is what Thompson says. Thompson actually turns around and comes up with reasons on both sides, and I will be discussing them a little bit later on. But this is a good summary of the issue about changing a continuum into dichotomous categories. So, having gone that far, let's do another quick pause and see see how you folks do on this next one. Might be a little tougher than the earlier one too. Here we go, Marissa.
Alrighty, the main theme most recently presented was, and go ahead and take some time to answer this one. Awesome. Thank you everybody for voting so quickly. I'll shut this down in just about a second. Awesome. Looks like 24% said an ethical parable and 76% said converting continua to dichotomies.
Okay, well, I would regard the third as correct. I guess I can see that there was a little bit of the other topic along the way, so I'll be a little bit more forgiving about this one. So moving on, that was, let's now talk a little bit about signal detection contingencies. Let me give you a couple of examples. This is, we look at, given the presence or the absence of some stimulus, we then look at the differential consequences of either responding or not responding. So a standard kind of thing is either the stimulus is present or there's no stimulus. This might be, say, a woman doing a breast self-examination, and she finds something there as she does her examination, which might or might not be a malignancy. So the question is, what does she say about whether she found something, given that there is something there that ought to be picked up, or nothing is there, or it's something that she won't have to worry about? Well, in that literature, if she says yes, given that there's something there, that is called a hit. If she says no, she missed it. If there's no stimulus there and she says yes, that's a false alarm. She'll be reporting it. She'll be worrying about it. It'll be a problem as far as the medical circumstances, because they worry about the costs of false alarms. But if she says no, that's a correct rejection. So in cancer screening, that means the malignancy might be treated, or it might go undetected, or the woman might get inappropriate treatment, or nothing happens. Some people have even extended this to things like journal editing. You're a reviewer, you get this article to review, and because you say yes to it, it ends up getting published. But if you say no to it, it gets up being rejected. Now, let's say it either has a major technical flaw in it or it doesn't. So If you said yes and it's published, that's a hit. If you said no and it gets rejected, that's a miss. And if this is a young faculty member who's going to use this article for promotion, that could be a big deal to have it rejected instead of published. On the other hand, if you say yes to it and it gets published, you got this article that proliferates stuff in the literature that turns out to then other people spend time on it. It can have all kinds of effects down the road. And if you think that doesn't happen, I just point you to an example we've often talked about, which is the whole literature of the hidden costs of reward, which came out of social psychology, in which many flawed pieces of research were published, which have had huge effects, extensive effects in the educational system, in which it has led teachers to feel that it's inappropriate to give artificial reward in the classroom. Or you read that flawed article and and it ends up being rejected, and that's the way it ought to be. So these are the kinds of examples. And can we take that and move on to I think, well, here's expanding a little bit. This was an example, kind of an example I used a while back when we also talked about political correctness. And we talked about whether you ban or don't ban a book. I bring this back now because we've got this whole business of book banning, which has become a part of the culture, especially in the South, where libraries are asked to ban books because a few parents feel it makes their children feel uncomfortable because of what's in the book. So those who want to ban the book will say this population will be protected. The ones who don't want to ban it, those population will be unprotected, or there's no effect. And now let's push it a little bit further. So we have a pregnant woman now, and at this point she has a fetus, and she's going to be doing all kinds of tests along the way now. We know a lot more about the condition of the fetus at various stages during her pregnancy than we used to. There's amniocentesis. There are all these tests that can be given, and it might be that this is a fetus that has some congenital deformity that will, say, affect the heartbeat or the central nervous system, and that there's no way this fetus is going to survive through childbirth, or at least very much beyond. On the other hand, the test might show that the fetus is viable. It's going this pregnancy is going to work out just fine. There's no now, if the fetus is never even going to develop into a living person, a child, and you report it as non-viable, then you're doing something ethical. If you don't find out that it's non-viable and you say, no, we're not going to do anything about it, perhaps the mother is going to have a miscarriage. If the fetus is viable, if this is a fetus that would have grown to term and would have been born without any major medical problems, then on the one hand, and by the way, I noticed I put here, this is potential contingencies during an unwanted pregnancy. We regard that as unethical, and now in many states in this country, a woman and perhaps the medical folks who assisted in in this abortion might go to prison. But if the answer is no, you have a child who is born but is unwanted, and all of the negative consequences of those kinds of circumstances. And who are we to say what the circumstances are that might have driven somebody to the point where they say, I just cannot handle wanting this child. And if we want to look at all of the those kinds of consequences, well, let me tell you, if you get into this literature, it's vast. And my apologies for using the word huge, which for me is a trigger word. I should have said vast in the past. But anyway, here's just one example of a very recent news bit. 64,000 women and girls over some period of time became pregnant during rape in states with abortion bans recently, over recent years, recent months. So those 50 and they were the result of almost over 500,000 rapes, which ended up producing almost 65,000 pregnancies in 14 states. These are women who then were going to be bearing a child as a consequence of rape in enormous numbers. And given the trauma of rape and given the consequences of having to do this, especially we've heard the stories of very young girls who have been forced to carry children, even if they're in their virtually preteens. Those are among the side effects. And whenever you look at contingencies from a signal detection point of view, you have to look at all of the different kinds of consequences. And if you want to look at the consequences of denying an abortion, this is one website, the Turnaway Study, which involves women who are turned away from the opportunity to have an abortion and some of the consequences for them and their lives. It is really informative to get a sense of what those contingencies are and how the lives of those women are affected. I showed that earlier one just as one piece of many kinds of statistics that you can look at to give you some notion of the magnitude of these issues. I was staggered by the magnitude and the number of rapes over a period of time. Yes, we do have a big population, but that's certainly something else that now what we tend to want to do is to arrange things rather than through reinforcement contingencies. But laws typically work not by rewarding certain kinds of behavior and shaping it up, but they arrange aversive contingencies and especially punishment rather than shaping through the use of reinforcement contingencies. So if we as behavior analysts advocate for the reinforcement of some kinds of behavior is preferable to using aversive control, we can't consistently support this advocacy and simultaneously support restrictions on abortion that are based on punitive measures coming out of a legal system. That at least is what seems to me. If we want to be consistent as behavior analysts, we typically will want to find alternatives to a punitive legal system. For those torn by the conflict, if you've got the conflict between choosing between the life of the fetus and the rights of the mother, here's something to remember, that policies are possible, and there have been some historically in which you can dig out of some statistics in which abortions are permitted, but because they are permitted and because of the support that's given and so forth, the number of abortions actually decreases relative to the number you would have gotten under policies in which abortion is disallowed and punished. So supposing you do have this thing, I use punishment to try to get rid of abortion. I don't like abortions. And certainly it's not a pleasant kind of thing to contemplate. You can see people who would be uncomfortable about abortion even if they support the woman's right to have one. But if it could be demonstrated that if you try punitive measures on abortion, you end up nevertheless back alley abortions that was a thing of back in the days before Roe versus Wade and so forth. If you have a situation where you actually have more abortions if you try to punish abortion than if you allowed abortions but gave pregnant mothers all sorts of support with respect to making the decision, and in that case you actually had fewer abortions, you would actually be achieving your objective of reducing the amount of abortions and avoiding the use of aversive contingencies. It's a difficult argument, but for those who are morally opposed to abortion, no matter what, it's a hard one to make, but it's certainly one that we should argue should be entertained. Policies that are judged by comparing lives lost or lives saved are inevitably ethically fraught. I'm going to use an example here. I grew up, I was old enough to know what was going on by the time the atomic bomb was used to end the Second World War in Japan, in the Pacific Theater. There is no question that it shortened the war, probably by years. And the threat was that if the main islands had been invaded, the Japanese were going to execute all prisoners of war. Certainly, many on the main islands would have been killed. As a young Japanese graduate student I once, who was once escorting me around in a visit to Japan, said, well, why is it not right to have had an atomic bomb drop, but it was okay to firebomb entire cities, and which is worse? And he had a kind of view of it that you don't hear very often. Now, if it turns out that at the time millions of lives were saved, and you balance that against the ones lost because of the bombs, that is an ethical dilemma. And I'm not going to take sides here. I know this is, as I say, it's a fraught issue. Uh, uh, but looking at it now is a bit different from looking at it at the time when in fact we know that an actual invasion of the Japanese mainland would have created huge casualties on both sides. As one final point before I move on, what about political policies that value the life of the fetus before the child is born, but provide little support afterwards? And unfortunately, we do have political circumstances in which there are people who are vehement about preventing abortions, but are also vehement about cutting funds used to support children who are below the poverty level, to support things like school lunches and things of that sort, to make sure the children are nourished, to make sure the children are covered by medical insurance and so on. These are all issues in which you pit these things, and again, without insisting, there's no easy way to take sides, but at least always know what the alternatives are. Always look at what happens if you do this versus what happens if you do that, and the signal detection analysis gives you a way of organizing that stuff and thinking about it. So here's poll question 3, and you might even guess what this one might be, given the character of some of the stuff before. Marissa, over to you.
Alrighty. So, 2 main topics recently presented were, and go ahead and take some time to answer this one. Awesome. Thank you all for voting so quickly. I will shut this down. And it looks like 9% say signal detection analysis, 30% say reinforcing versus aversive contingencies, 4% say neither A or B, and 57% say both A and B.
Interesting. It's a curious kind of thing that signal detection was one of the last sentences just before we had the question. Anyway, on we go. So now let's talk a little bit about the role of verbal behavior. This is another one of those things that gets us into ethical tangles and other things. So remember, the point early on was that we start out with these word categories, which lead us to break things down into discrete categories rather than continua. And let's just look at what happens here. The choice of pro-life versus pro-choice was made early on for political reasons. And those who came up with pro-life as a label recognize that once you say that one side is pro-life, and then you ask, well, what must the other side be? The tendency is, well, if you're not pro-life, then you must be anti-life. And so you immediately have a thing that wipes out all other possible contingencies and other considerations, and creates a verbal dichotomy that depends upon a long history of things in which you're pro or anti, you're for or against. So the choice of labels, and that's going on in politics today. If you read what's going on as we look through the campaigns, and they're growing, they're going to be hitting us with more and more ads as the time goes on up to the election next November. You'll find that very often they'll involve labels in which once you start working with these labels, they also carry along a whole set of other relationships that already exist. The folks who study relational frames like to look at that sort of thing, by the way. And then there's voluntary versus involuntary. So now for us, as there's a tendency for us to say that if it's voluntary, that makes it operant, and if it's involuntary, it's respondent. But clearly, when we start looking at the things that determine behavior, we have behavior that is not Pavlovian, not reflexive, but in which the number of variables that enter into determining that this is what this person is going to do become really strong, and we would say that's voluntary. That's still voluntary behavior, even though it's very, very highly determined. But if it's going to happen no matter what, wouldn't you want to call it involuntary? So now, how about, is there such a thing as involuntary abortion? And if you wonder about that, once you start thinking about that, seems strange, because if you have an abortion but it's involuntary, does that make you someone who is subject to legal action if you were live in one of those states in which an abortion occurring at this particular time in your pregnancy is illegal? Well, with respect to other kinds of things that are called crimes like murder, there's a distinction between intentional murder and involuntary manslaughter. You didn't mean to kill this person when you drove too fast through this intersection, but the person died nevertheless. So there is that category. Well, then, what is a miscarriage? Is a miscarriage essentially an involuntary abortion? Well, yeah, you can induce a miscarriage. So then move on to the language of miscarriage versus abortion. It's a miscarriage if you didn't do anything and it happened. It's an abortion if somebody did something and it happened. But then sometimes you have the medical profession finding that somebody has got a fetus that, if carried to term, will not be viable and will also have serious implications for the health of the mother. And so they may induce a miscarriage, just as they can induce labor for other reasons. They can induce a miscarriage at various points along there. So an induced miscarriage, how is that different? How is that different from an involuntary abortion? The legal system has created things which take what might not have been an important distinction if we had been just talking about things that are happening during the course of a pregnancy, and forced us to put them in different kinds of categories which we approve of or don't approve of based on other considerations. Is there such a thing as an involuntary abortion? Well, wouldn't a miscarriage be an involuntary abortion? This is not to solve any of these problems. We can't solve them. The verbal communities in different places have a long history, some of it coming from religious views, some of it coming from family traditions and ethnic traditions, all sorts of determinants over time, and have led us to these different vocabularies, but they don't have to be compatible with each other. And we have to struggle with what happens because the legal system has acquired this kind of dominance over other things. You know, does the Supreme Court really have the last word on these things? But where then does the histories that determined these words and their functions come from? That's a problem that we behavior analysts can say something about, but we don't have access to, well, put it to the levers um, that make a difference, except to the extent that you might want to argue that the levers in a voting booth might make a difference. But that's too much of a, and I don't really intend that as a pun, but rather it's an analogy. So let's say, so how about the language of rights? And that's another one of those things that the unborn fetus is then said by some to have a right to life. but the mother has certain rights too. But where in evolutionary contingencies do rights emerge? At one point, can you say, this belongs to me and nobody should be allowed to take it away? Well, certainly biological contingencies take things away all the time. Cancer cells shouldn't have a right to take away the lives of people, or even to make them really unpleasant, even if treatment resolves the issues. Now, so I want to continue with some ethical parables. You've had available 2 downloadable handouts. One of them is this paper by Judith Jarvis Thompson. I included a little excerpt earlier, and the other is an op-ed piece by Ben Williams, who, by the way, I credit with having informed me about the Thompson paper. And I think actually, though, I misspelled Thompson here. It should, let's see if that's right. Okay, well, anyway, I'm pretty sure that's Thompson with, yeah, without the P. And since I'm here still, I find it convenient to work in this mode because I can see on the sidebar here where I am in the paper. I'm going to correct it right now. And I'll save this when we finish. So I thank Ben for alerting me to these. And I found them significant enough and relevant enough to this that I thought you folks. So consider the following scenario. A woman is carrying within her the potential for the life of another. She originally consented to facilitating that other life, but her circumstances have changed. She now wants to withdraw that consent. Can she ethically do so? Now, I put this up in this way with the hope that you look at this and you immediately make some assumptions. You make the assumption that this is a woman who is carrying within her a fetus, which has the potential for life after birth. And she originally consented. She wanted to have this child, but now something's happened. Maybe she's learned that the fetus does have some congenital defect that will make it unviable. Maybe she thought she could support the child, but she now thinks that the child, because of she has other children and she had a change in her circumstances, she won't be able to support the child. Maybe she's got a psychiatric issue, and dealing with that and dealing with the child are just things that, whatever the reason, she now wants to withdraw that consent. Is it ethical for her to do so? And of course, we could come up with different reasons depending what the circumstances are. We might be willing to give her more leeway if it turns out she learned something about the viability of the child she's carrying than if she's got some other personal reasons. Whatever the case, though, let's pursue this because actually that's not what this scenario is going to develop into. And here, what she carries within her is her own kidney. She'd originally consented to be an organ donor for a stranger. She's in the operating room along with the originally intended recipient who will die without the transplant. But she's just learned that her twin, for whom she's also a match, now needs the kidney. So she now wants to withdraw her consent. She wants to give the kidney to her twin rather than to this stranger lying on the gurney across from her. Can she be ethically compelled to do so? Can she be compelled to go through with her donation? It's her kidney. Doesn't she have the right to say, no, I don't want to go through this operation? Yeah, I did sign that consent thing, but now because my sister is in jeopardy, I want to give it to my sister. Is it unethical for her to do this? Is she obliged to give her kidney to the stranger? It's got some of the same things about the medical risks. You know, there's some risk in having your kidney removed and having it transplanted. There's always the possibility of infection and other side effects of surgery and so on. So she is really going to be inconvenienced for some time. And she'll be without a kidney herself, so that if something happens to her other kidney, she's got problems. I probably should have put in a poll question right here and said and asked you folks to come up with your judgment, and I now regret that I missed doing that. I guess, Marissa, it's too late to insert a question like that, isn't it? But anyway, never mind. Let's move on. Analogies, of course, break down. but there's still some level at which this woman's situation is similar to that of the pregnant woman who's faced with the issue of being a pregnancy to term. She's carrying a fetus, not a kidney, but by carrying that fetus, she's facilitating the life of another. Presumably it's her child, but maybe not. Maybe she's a surrogate mother. And what if she became pregnant because of rape or incest? She didn't even sign the thing saying that she consented. What if she's got more children than she can handle already? What if she's unexpectedly a widow, no longer has support to raise a child? We could add so many other circumstances, but then we need some criteria for which ones are legitimate and which ones aren't. So here's Thompson actually in that article from. So this is similar. This is now the thing, the same article from which I quoted earlier. Imagine this: you wake up in the morning and find yourself in bed with a famous unconscious violinist. He has a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours, so your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood. The director of the hospital tells you, look, we're sorry the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it if we had known. But still, they did it. And the violinist now is plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him, but it's only for 9 months. By then, he will have recovered from his ailment and he can safely be unplugged from you. That now is an even closer parallel because it's got the time in it. And remember that this was one of the papers you could download if you want to read it. Here's Ben Williams' take on similar kind of thing. A relative for whom you have no special attachment is dying of kidney disease, and no suitable donor can be found because of the rarity of the patient's genotype. You, however, share the genotype and would be a suitable donor. Most likely, you could survive with only one kidney, but you don't want to take the risk of an operation, the possibility that something might happen to your remaining healthy kidney. Is it reasonable that the government be empowered to compel you to provide one of your healthy kidneys to the patient? The answer is no for most people, including those most often insistent that abortions be criminalized. If a pregnant mother is required to carry the fetus against her will, shouldn't the potential kidney donor be required to provide a kidney? And Williams is arguing that by legal precedent, in both cases, the government would be enforcing a form of involuntary servitude that presumably is not allowed by the Constitution. And yet, in many states now that have laws that prohibit abortion after some early time in pregnancy, or maybe absolutely in some cases, most of those, there's not even an exception for rape. And that's certainly an involuntary pregnancy, and one in which the woman who was raped certainly did not provide consent. And if one adds in instances of incest, which also, of course, is could be categorized as rape as well, but often there are things that have gone on so that the relationship between the father and the pregnant mother are such that she might not even want to report it that way, depending upon what history there is in the family. So it's exceedingly complex. And these are the kinds of arguments and the parallels that we would hope would be taken into account in any legal system that really wanted to realistically deal with these things based on what we know about biology and what we know about. So we've hardly touched on the verbal behavior rights and ethics just by, but giving these examples gives us an idea of the magnitude of the issues. But eventually, we've got to address them because they provide the contingencies, especially the legal ones, with which abortion issues are dealt with in our culture. We behavior analysts have had little to say about rights, but they are a potent part of verbal behavior, and legal systems are verbal systems. They are essentially a version of verbal governance. So this think of this as an introduction to thing. This is where I've gotten in trying to grapple with these problems, and in also trying to present something to you and to show the ways in which there are issues that we behavior analysts haven't addressed, but maybe should. We barely scratch the surface. So here we can't resolve these. Certainly we can't. But people have been worrying about these things for decades. But at least we can acknowledge that for us as behavior analysts, we've got to grapple with these kinds of things if we want to bring a behavioral account to bear on how legal systems address these significant social issues. So let's have one more poll question.
Alrighty, everybody. So the main ethical analogy to pregnancy just discussed was
I hope this one's really easy.
alrighty, let's shut it down. Wow, looks like 100% said someone donating an organ.
Way! Great. Thank you, folks. Really do appreciate that. Okay. So now let's move on to still another topic. This is one again, and probably if I were well enough informed, if I had enough of a background, we could probably spend a whole webinar just on this topic, but it's one that a colleague of mine, his name is a late colleague of mine, his name was Bob Provine, for a while taught a course called Before We Were Born in the psychology department at UMBC. So I know a little about this from osmosis through talking to him about his course over the years. Not a huge amount, but enough to say a little bit about it, and at least to offer you folks some resources too. So if you look at books about this topic, what happens before we are born, most of them will be about the anatomical changes in the fetus over the course of prenatal development. And they'll talk about how the succession of organs, how various cell groups fold over and form the alimentary canal, and when the various organs begin to take shape, things like the blood supply developing, and eventually the heart developing to the point where you get the heartbeat, and a little bit about movement, but not a lot. There'll be the point at which you get what's called quickening, and the mother is suddenly feeling the child moving around and kicking inside, and so on. We'll talk just about a few of those things, but that's really a substantial part of the argument. And so it's not a behavioral criterion that's brought to bear when people talk about when you would be willing to still tolerate an abortion. And of course, behavior is less visible under these circumstances. The kicking, yeah, the mother can feel it, but and presumably the father who or the parent who touches the mother's stomach might feel it too. But to the extent that the fetus is behaving, a lot of that is not particularly obvious. And so it hasn't been studied anywhere near to the extent the behavior is studied once the child has been born and is in our environment rather than the environment inside the womb. But it would be significant. And so I put down just a couple of things that I know a little bit about. There is enough transmission through the air and through the mother's stomach, or probably also through bone conduction, and within the mother's body as well, that there is a point at which the infant has developed ears, and the ears have reached the point where the child is hearing the mother's voice. The fetus probably also eventually can hear a little bit of the voices of others, but almost certainly to a lesser extent. So the dominant sound the infant is hearing is the mother, and if it's her voice, she's speaking. So what's going to happen over time is the ways in which the sounds change are going to depend on the language that the mother speaks. What's the mother's native language? If she speaks English, there are going to be certain kinds of units of sound that are going to occur with some regularity and in some relationship to other sounds. And we call those the vowels and the consonants. They're the characteristics specifically of English. They're going to be different from the characteristics of a mother who speaks some other language, say Arabic, or maybe Chinese or Japanese, or maybe Bantu, or you pick a language anywhere around the world. They're all different. And many of them have different sets of sounds that we call the phonemes of that language. Now, if this fetus is developing inside an English-speaking mother, then the child will sometimes hear the sound that we call B, and will sometimes hear the sound that we call P. And those will occur in different relations to other sounds, and they will occur with some regularity. And in fact, the fetus won't hear much of sounds that are right in between those two. And even though we don't know what the child's behavior might be with respect to that, we do know from the child's behavior after birth that even at that time it was making a difference. Because what we can do after the child is born is we can do these little experiments in which we put a pacifier essentially in the child's mouth, and we connect it to a pressure recording system, and we can measure the child's suckling on the pacifier. And if we do that and the child is going along very steadily and suddenly a voice says B, the child will stop briefly, which tells us that this child heard the B. If we do it again, the child will stop a little bit, but not as much. Do it again, not as much. And eventually, as we call it, the child will habituate to hearing the B and will stop responding much to it. It's no longer novel. But then the voice switches to P. And what happens then is the child stops for a brief time now. And the fact that the child now stops after the P, after the change, means this child hears the difference between those two sounds. And the evidence is mounting that the reason that that difference has become important is that the child has been hearing that difference and not hearing much at the boundaries throughout that time. So the child has been doing some kind of engaged in some kind of behavior, and we might want to call that behavior listening. We don't have a good handle on what that is and how it goes on, but we do know that hearing those sounds makes it easier for this child to then learn to respond to the units of speech and the language that this child is going to be learning once the child begins babbling and speaking on her own or his own. Now remember, I started with an example in which I also mentioned the Arabic child or the Arabic fetus. That one will be hearing this sound that's sort of an intermediate between a P and a B. But in Arabic, there are not two separate consonants called P and B. There's this one sound that's somewhat in the middle. And if we do that experiment with the suckling and the habituation of that to the one sound, and then the recovery of the response to it with a change, we find that the child who is developed inside the Arabic-speaking mother and the infant born to that mother is insensitive to the difference between B and P. So even prenatally, we might have in the listening the precursors of what becomes the phonetic structure of the particular language that is the language of this developing fetus's and eventual child's caregivers. So if we're interested in verbal behavior, we're going to look at the early parts of it. When we talk about echoic behavior, we're talking about something that's got a long history. And if you count the prenatal time, you have weeks, maybe months, in which this has been going on, and in which the child has been learning to distinguish among the various sounds that have become crucial in the phonetic structure of the child's talk later on. And yeah, it comes along so beautifully and so quickly that we might be tempted to say it's all somehow built in and pre-wired. But understanding this process gives us a way of talking about how the environment might have built it. Well, that's really the thing that happens over the later part of the woman's pregnancy and the bearing of this fetus to the point of reaching the term and giving birth to this infant. But there's more that happens early on, even before the movement has become really big to the point where the mother can easily feel it. And this, by the way, is another thing I attribute to my colleague, my late colleague, Bob Provine. Um, um, Both he and I independently had been talking about the problems of the language of responding, which is the response is always a response to something. And operant behavior implies that the response is emitted. It's not a response to something. It's just a response. It gets emitted, just as the emission of a particle from the nucleus of a radioactive substance is talked about as emission. It isn't because something has hit this nucleus. This just gets emitted from time to time. It emits a particle as it's decaying. Well, so too behavior can just get emitted, and so we independently toyed with the ideas of using the word sponse instead of response. And the nice thing about sponse is you don't have to say it was a response to something. You do want to have a response being a response to something. And actually, we could say it's a response to a set of contingencies if we want. That's maybe more reasonable for the way we talk about things. But a response is truly emitted. And one of the things that happens during early fetal development is the muscles are growing, the bones are firming up, and they are moving around, and the fetus is sponding. It's spontaneously moving around. And one of the consequences of doing that is that in the ball and joint socket, the socket and the joint that's holding it, they are being sculpted. Their shape and their attachments are in part determined by these movements. If the limb was perfectly still as this fetus was developing, and the fetus didn't move these joints, then the way the knees form, the way the ankle forms, the wrists, the elbows, the rotator cuffs, and all of that, they would not develop in appropriate ways, and the child would, or the eventual child would probably not be viable, because there'd be a whole bunch of things, including the rib cage and the muscles attaching there, and all the things involved in muscular control and the rib cage breathing. All of these things would be developing totally differently, and perhaps in a way that makes this fetus unviable, except for the fact that this fetus is sponding all the time. And to me, it's aesthetically beautiful that this not yet born person, if you want to call the fetus that, is behaving and is emitting behavior right from the beginning and long before it's in a position to be engaging in elicited responding. This is, it seems to me, an important kind of history to know about. And the thing is, though, that, well, anyway, so when I first started, when I undertook to present this topic today, I wanted to spend a lot of our time on this particular perspective and talk about the course of development. And it quickly became clear to me that there's this huge relevant literature, but an awful lot of it is concerned mainly with the developing anatomy. And that in combination, that a lot of it needs to be reinterpreted from a behavioral perspective, means that there was a limit to what I could do. So I gave you a little bit of this stuff here about the mother's voice and what the developing fetus can hear, and this thing on responding versus sponding, because they are the two handles I saw on getting to know more about this stuff. There's probably a lot more. And if a couple of you end up going off and wanting to study this further and you get more, that would be great, because what better thing could you do than not just buying all of this without being critical of it, but building on it. And that would please me exceedingly. So if you do want to learn more, um, this is actually, there are several textbooks called Before We Were Born, Before We Are Born, Before You Were Born. They've run through, I think, probably all the permutations on that. Here's one of them, and this particular link is one where you can actually download it. What the publishers did was they excerpted and removed all of the end of chapter study questions and things like that. So this is a nice way to survey the developing anatomy, but it is mainly that and some physiology. So that's my caveat, my caution to you. If you go into one of these, don't expect to see a lot about behavior. There's lots of information on changes in anatomy, a lot about changes in physiology over time, but there's just a little bit about changes in behavior. So, but there it is, and that's my resource for you. And now, um, I think this is a topic that does call for discussion. So this is the end of the formal part of my presentation. And so let me, let me, um, oh, well, not quite actually. So let me just do one more poll question, and then we have a little bit more. Um, so Marissa, here's question number 5.
All right. So developments of fetal behavior we discussed included. And go ahead and take some time to answer this last one. Awesome. Thank you all for voting. I'll shut this down. Looks like, wow, 26% say responsiveness to the mother's voice and 74% say both A and B.
Okay, so some folks missed the business about the sculpting of the joints. Okay, and so then I meant not to say this before that question, but I meant to say it after that question. I want to get feedback too, because this is the first time I've ever talked on this particular topic. And so I really need to get some feedback as to which things are you think I could have elaborated on better or differently. One more question right away. Here's question number 6.
All right. So, do you have any questions for the presenter? Go ahead and take some time to answer this poll about it. And if you do, go ahead and start putting it into the questions box as well, so this way we can get some time to answer it. Awesome. I'll shut this down. Looks like 5% say several, 5% say
Okay,
just one,
and 20.
26%
Okay.
say and
There's no
62.
wrong answer to this one, of course. Okay. So I guess for an organizing thing for discussion, remember this was our working outline, and it does include some of the major topics we talked about. So I'll leave that up just for people to look at. If you've got a question, type it in and send it to Marissa, and she will be the moderator of these. And depending upon the number of questions and the complexity and so forth, give me the real softball ones first, Marissa.
Alrighty, go ahead and put your questions in the questions box. I did want to remind everybody to go ahead and purchase their CEUs if they haven't already. And I will be looking at um all of the information for your CE certificates tomorrow morning, so you'll receive your instructions for your certificates by lunchtime. And in just about an hour, you'll receive your general certificate of attendance. All right, just waiting for some questions to come in. Oh, perfect. So What do you think about an argument for abortion based on sentence? I would maintain that sentence is what makes us
I missed that
human.
word. An argument based on what?
Sensuous? I've never seen the word before, I'm sorry.
Oh,
So,
sentience?
yeah,
Sentience. Okay. Okay.
is what makes us human. Sorry about that. A lot of pro-life people focus on conception or viability, but that is not an indication of humanness.
Hmm. That's an interesting question. The problem is that it would, I would guess that in some general sense of sentience, which means being sensitive to things either things about oneself or things in the environment, I guess I might translate into something like awareness. Um, the problem is how you would measure that for the developing fetus. Um, my guess would be that those who would, no matter what the definition of sentience was, that most people would want to say that the fetus who's now hearing and differentially responding to the sounds of the mother's voice is sentient, even if in a very limited way. But how could you test that? How could you find it out if you thought that that was the point at which you wanted to divide up this continuum of the time from between conception and birth? I don't know what you go in and measure on the part of it. It's not like amniocentesis or some of these other things where, I mean, you can get a look at the developing fetus and you can see the fetus moving there, and that's the point at which the parents will say, yes, that's my child. And you could even see the heartbeat. You can measure the heartbeat, so you can say, oh, that's in place. You can make guesses about the nervous system, of course, but you won't be able to measure its activity in a similar kind of way. But how can you say what this organism is sensitive to? So that's the problem. If you're going to come up with some criterion, then what's the criterion for life? Some will say it's you can finally hear the heartbeat. Well, is it not alive before the heart is developed to the point where, after all, throughout these early times in development, the child's or the developing fetus is being supported by the circulating mother's blood, which comes through the umbilical cord to the fetus, and eventually the heart takes over, and and the fetus has become big enough that you need this auxiliary circulation to keep all the parts bathed in the appropriate nutrients and all through the blood supply. But even that's hard to do and is changing continuously. So that's what I see as the hang up there. And that would be a similar hang up to saying it's got to be personhood, or it's got to be soul, or it's got to be life. Um, movement is one criterion. Some say quickening, and that's the point to which the mother can feel the child moving, kicking, or whatever. And notice, by the way, I find it a little bit awkward to correct myself and say fetus some of the time. It's so much easier to say the developing child, even though this is a fetus that hasn't yet been born. But the language of fetus is a peculiar one because it creates a dichotomy between this child, between conception and birth, and this child from the moment of birth afterwards. That is, in terms of what goes on at birth, yes, it is a kind of a discontinuity. The child is now moved to a different environment, but throughout, it's also reasonable enough to say, hey, there's no reason not to call this a child rather than a fetus at any point, because there's a continuous relationship in its growth, his growth, uh, throughout the entire pregnancy and all of the time afterwards. So there again, it's another one of those cases where our vocabulary tends us to build dichotomies where there are, and to overlook certain continuities. Um, an abortion uh, 3 days before birth a forced abortion. Well, or maybe that's just cesarean section, uh, and then the question is, what do you do with it? And or and so that is another illustration of some of the, I mean, some ways of removing the child from the mother's womb are different from others, and those too are complicated by peculiarities of our vocabulary. That's a kind of a long-winded answer, but I hope it's satisfactory for the moment. But feel free, by the way, that whoever wrote that to give us a follow-up. Got any
Yeah,
others?
there's actually part two right here. Is the sponding versus responding a proxy for sentience?
A proxy for what?
For sentience.
I don't think so. I think it's. I mean, that's just my. Um, the You could argue that a totally respondent thing, like responding to a visual or an auditory stimulus in a Pavlovian situation, the dog must be responsive to these as stimuli, and to the extent that becomes very good at distinguishing among lots of different classes, I would say that's a sentient organism. Some people would, there used to be the things about the person who is just connected to the world by who had some kind of problems, and so there's all kinds of artificial stuff put in place to connect this individual to the environment. We're getting closer to things like that. Um, Somebody's lost a limb, and now a prosthesis has been put in, and now there are ways in which there can be sensors put in to the prosthetic limb, so the person who's received the prosthetic limb can now eventually come to feel things at a distance. And there's a way in which we already do that. If you're at the steering wheel of a car, you're feeling things about the car that are distant from you. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Pavlovian relationships, if you can sense them. I mean, that's where the word sentience comes from. It's making a noun out of sensing. So we sense things in the world around us. If we sense things in the world around us, then every creature that senses things in the world around us, I guess we'd have to say, is sentient. The bees are sentient with respect to the colors of flowers, and they're sentient to some colors of flowers that we don't even see because they're responsive to a different part of the visual of the spectrum, including parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that we don't see. Um, so if sentience just is responsiveness to things in the world, then it's a very general kind of thing, and it probably starts very early, and it's a thing we share with just about with probably a vast majority of creatures. You could even argue that because plants respond to things in the environment, and they have systems that make them responsive to things in the environment, that plants are sentient too. I don't know how far you want to go with that. Plants behave too. They just do it a lot more slowly than we do. Most of them do. Some of them can move a little bit more quickly. The Venus flytrap can move quickly enough to trap an insect between its leaves when it closes down on a fly. But if sentience is it, then do we have an ethical right to do things to other creatures who aren't human? Because if its sentience becomes your criterion without it being human sentience, then you've got a different kind of problem. You've got to become a Jainist. That is the religion in which you want to be careful when you're walking down the road that you don't step on anything and kill it either. Um, I don't think that's going to work for most of at least most of our contemporary uh, population in our contemporary culture.
Alrighty.
So
If a fetus responds primarily to the voice of the birth mother, what are some ethical considerations to adoption?
again, I didn't catch the end of that. I caught. Could you just say it again?
Yeah, if a fetus responds primarily to the voice of the birth mother, what are some ethical considerations to adoption?
Oh, That's a curious one. That catches me a little bit. I don't know that there would be. I mean, particularly if, I mean, I was talking about the fetus mostly hearing the mother's sound because they would be transmitted uh, through her body as well as through the air and then through her body to the fetus inside the uterus. And because they are transmitted in that way, they're going to be louder than any of the other sounds, but some of them probably come through from daddy and some of them come through from others. Um, Now, it might be a little bit harder on the infant if the infant after birth is now hearing the caregivers as being different speakers, um, or carriers are speaking a different language and now has to learn different kinds of distinctions among the phonemes uh, than the uh, than the infant had heard while the infant was still the fetus. Um, but but from in the early years, infants are really good at picking up sounds of different languages if they're raised in a household where the parents are multilingual. So if you live in an area of Switzerland where you're in the borderline between the Italian speaking South and the French speaking West and the German speaking North. And so you've got all three languages come up some of the time, but your mother mostly speaks one of those, and other people in the family might speak one or another of them from time to time, or visitors do. You're still going to pick up all the others very quickly. And once you become a kid and you're now talking to people in all these languages, um, even in the very early months, this child is going to acquire those new languages very, very quickly and certainly far more easily than an adult will. So I don't think that the child would be disadvantaged that much by being adopted by a surrogate, by someone else. And if those are the circumstances, I don't think that's a big. I wouldn't think that's a big deal ethically. Other people might have other opinions, and I'm giving you this right off the cuff. On the basis of this response. But what we know about language development is in those early months, the things that children are learning, they're learning very quickly. Now, there is some suspicion that once one's learned those phonemic units, that those get laid down in a way that may have a neurological correlate, and those boundaries get fixed pretty well. But then there's enough enough of development still available. There's still enough opportunity for the nervous system as it develops to develop an adjacent area that deals with the second language and third language. And some people could manage a lot of different languages. We have the greatest lability. That is, the lability is the possibility of change early on and become less and less able to change the older we get as the nervous system gets more and more locked into the patterns that were created by the environments. In this case, created by the acoustic environments. The environments sculpted these kinds of distinctions. Tell me if that worked, okay? If you give me a follow-up if you think it needs more than that. Um,
Alrighty. There is one last question in here. What are some reinforcement contingencies for carrying a fetus to term, especially in the case of unwanted pregnancy?
what are some of the contingencies of not carrying to term in an unwanted pregnancy? Oh, gee.
Of
Um,
carrying to term.
yeah, I mean, if you look into this and read any of this literature that's out there, and then just put in abortion, unwanted pregnancy, and do a Google search, and much of what you'll come up with is a lot of anecdotes about mothers who are in really difficult situations. You got everything from these uh, very young women who were raped and forced to carry this this fetus to term, and all of the problems that this is um, already had facing enough difficulties if raised under conditions of poverty, and this on top of all of those difficulties. Others in abusive relationships, and that also, I mean, just because this might be a married woman, if the married woman is raped in this relationship, there are some states which will make it very difficult for the woman to be able to claim that this was rape, even though her husband did it. There you've got all kinds of problems. Um, and part of it is also you want to ask about the long-term contingencies. If the act of rape is reinforced, even though with a very substantial delay, by having one's offspring growing up, I mean that's a thing that's built into this culture of male dominance and superiority too. It's just a vast number of examples, and I suspect if you go to do that kind of search, you could probably come up with a dozen examples, and many of them will have only a few things in common. You might be able to pick out this one particular case in which the woman talks about all the reasons why this pregnancy wasn't wanted, in which you come up to the next example, and only a few of those are shared by another woman who's also in difficult circumstances. So I do not know that well enough to feel that I could pick out particular ones and say they're more significant than others. I think that would be inappropriate for us to do so. I mean, but there's just so much out there, and the numbers are so big once you start looking into this literature. There really does seem to be a huge problem, um, and it's not just in our culture. I mean, we know that in India they're just beginning to address. It's only in the past few decades that they're beginning to address the treatment of women in this other huge country, which very soon, by the way, will overtake China in population. And in a country like China, you just don't hear much about it because we don't have access. We don't know what kinds of statistics they keep on these kinds of things. It's certainly true throughout the developing world. Um, so that's about the best I can say there. Um, so is there another one? If
Um,
there isn't, I have a little bit I could follow up on an earlier question. Um,
yeah, there is one last question in here actually. If we were to look at the BACB ethical code, would abortion be more or less ethical than an unwanted child, and therefore the possibility of neglect or abuse?
ah, well, that again is trying to dichotomize what is really a continuum kind of thing, because how much neglect or abuse? You're going to have all sorts of degrees of it. You're going to have the kid whose father is an advanced alcoholic and is a problem every day, and whereas the one who is kind of managing okay most of the time, but once in a while lets it go and maybe hits the kid or does something like that, but it only happens once in a while. And you certainly want to be more tolerant of the latter, especially if the father is working on it, than with the former. Now, as a general policy, I think most of our ethical stuff was written not to cover all ethical issues. There's no way we can do that. Um, but mainly the behavioral issues confronted by a caregiver who's applying behavior analysis. And therefore, what we have come to worry about the most are, as people delivering behavior analysis services, what we want to do is teach the people who are doing that um, what are the things they can do that are ethical and what are the things that they might do which we would regard as unethical. And we tend to do that along the dimension of least restrictive and along the dimension of limiting aversive contingencies. Now that's because the ethics are directed to the ethics of the practitioners who's delivering the service. We are not, as behavior analysts, telling parents this is what you have to do to be an ethical parent, or to tell mothers this is what you have to do during pregnancy to be an ethical potential parent. Um, those kinds of things are in other codes of ethics. and they are probably involved in the ethics of legal systems. Some outfits write up their own ethical systems, and that can be a problem. But we don't write up the ethics. We write up the ethics for us, just as we would expect Supreme Court judges to follow ethical principles. But if they write up their own ethics, we would want them to be answerable to somebody, or at least to be able to show us that this is what they do and that they are consistent with it. And whether you can go into the news and look into that. Right now, they do not. Their ethical system is not answerable to Congress or to anybody else at the moment, but probably it should be, because it's verbal behavior, and it's verbal behavior that governs the behavior of a huge legal system. And for that to be solely verbal and not to have any constraints upon it is really, I think, potentially over the long run, a problem. A verbal system that sort of stands by itself and not responsive to external contingencies. And those are the things we really have to worry about. Maybe I'm being a little bit too political here, but these are terribly important issues. So, have any others come in since this last one?
Nope, no other question.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left. Let me just then therefore close on a more positive. I mean, some of this stuff makes us worry a lot because these are such substantial issues, and there's a limit to how much we can do. But I think we're moving in a good direction. And there are other things that are built into this that I would urge you to pay attention to. Another one of the talks, the webinars I gave a while back, was on freedom, and I also gave one on diversity. And in the business of talking about how the developing fetus might become responsive to her or his hearing the mother's voice, there are also other features of that built in that tie into these questions of diversity and of variations, and that is that it probably is the case that because of that, after this child is born, the mother's voice, relative to the voice of all other women that this child may encounter, this newborn may encounter, is going to be recognizable and distinctively different. So we come from a species in which mothers and fathers very soon can distinguish the voices of significant others around them, can distinguish the voices of their children from the voices of other children. And stop and think about that. These are voices, and we have an auditory system combined with a system of vocal production, which makes the sounds of every individual so different, and the auditory capacities of every individual so sensitive that just picking up the telephone and hearing somebody we know very well saying just a couple of words, and we know who that person is. And the variations are possible over all the many, many hundreds of individuals we've come to know and to deal with. All of those variations are necessary if we're going to be able to do that. And that means that variations are necessary. And it turns out, by the way, penguins do that. You may know that penguins, when they come back to the roosting area, the father is there nursing the newly hatched baby penguin, and the mother goes off to get food, and she may be away for days, and when she comes back, there's this place where you've got just thousands of penguins, and she's got to find him and her child. And she does it, and one of the reasons is it turns out that the penguins' vocalizations are individually different enough, we don't hear it particularly well, but the penguins do, that she can single out the voice of her mate among all those thousands of others. So penguins do it. Other primates do it. Many creatures do it, and it's a very general system that creates variability, which is another way of talking about diversity, and it is essential for the relationship between the parent and the child and all of the people that are significant to them. So, yeah, we learn about these things as we address questions like these. And they make it all a beautiful system to study, and it seems to be consistent with so many other things we know. Talk about the fineness of distinctions, our capacity to hear and produce all of these small differences. That is the essence of variability. Variability underpins the significance of the operant, the class of responses that has to have variations in it for all of this stuff to hold together. That's the stuff we do, folks. I hope you found this useful. Take care and see you next time, I hope.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you everybody for joining. We will see you next month. For what's next month's session? Do you remember, Charlie?
Um, I did a little bit ago. Yeah, it's linguistics. I'm going to talk.
It was
I've recently fortunate to the I've under things I would not have predicted could have happened if you'd asked me about a year and a half ago. But I've had three. I had an interview by a Spanish group called Ingrama, and as a result of that, and they did a thing that they put on YouTube, and as a result of that, uh, they suggested that I have a debate with Noam Chomsky, and and I wrote back and said, well, wait a minute, do we have to call it a debate? Can we have a discussion or a conversation? And they agreed to that, and so did Noam Chomsky. So I've had four separate meetings with him in which we had discussions hosted by the Engrama folks. Three of them are now available online on YouTube. The third one just became public just a couple of days ago. And the fourth one needs to be edited because they put in Spanish subtitles and all, and will be out. Unfortunately, it may well be the last one. But if anybody is interested in that, the Engrama is Engrama. Engrama. If you do a search for Engrama, Chomsky, my last name, Catania, and YouTube, those will be early things you come up with, and you can watch them if you're interested. So next time I'm going to talk a bit about what led up to those discussions, about the history of the debate between linguistics and Skinner's verbal behavior, and some of the ways in which I ended up accidentally getting involved in that over the years. So and where we are now, and to tell a little about those debates and what they not debates, those things, and where we've gotten, which to me is astonishingly good, because it worked out so much better than I ever could have anticipated in terms of the cordiality of our discussion, but also where we got and the kinds of things that where we could find some consensus, which I think is in the long run really important and far better than having feuding disciplines, which I think both sides saw as being the circumstances if you go back a way. So that'll be next time.
Okay, everybody. Have a great rest of your week. We'll see you next time. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you. Take care.